I think everyone will bear with us there. But again, sir, first question I want to ask you is your family okay? Are you okay? And just want to check up on that front first before we begin the discussion.
Yes, thank you, we're all fine. And although some have advised me to move, but I will remain at home. And people across the country, of course, are facing new circumstances. The first hours of the attack were very shocking for Iranians because it was unprovoked. And in our neighborhood, we've had people murdered, children killed, parents murdered. And not very far away, a complete building was brought down by the Israeli regime, killing, I think, roughly 60 people, including 20 children. So these are not good circumstances, but this was an unprovoked war, and we have to remain steadfast until the Israeli regime is forced to end its aggression.
Why are you not moving from home, considering the circumstances and all the other leaders or influential figures that have been assassinated?
Well, I'm not a government official, and I never was. I'm an academic. I just try to explain Iran better and the way I see it so that people better understand the country, since Western media is so hostile towards Iran and so irrational towards Iran and so biased towards the Israeli regime. That's how it's been since my childhood. And so as an academic, as an individual, I feel I am responsible. And since some people, friends, think that that may cause me trouble under the circumstances, they've asked me to move to another place, but I don't think that is appropriate. I think that I should do what I have to do, and I have no fears.
Let's discuss the attack. As you said, it was a surprise to Iran. You said also it was unprovoked. Obviously, there's ways to debate this. Was it unprovoked, considering what the IAEA has announced in not being able to verify that Iran is not building nuclear weapons? But at the same time, there were negotiations that were planned for Sunday, and really no one expected this. When people asked me, even though there were the evacuations at the US embassies, even I didn't expect not only an Israeli attack, but the size of the attack. So my first point, or my first question is, what was your initial reaction, and what do we know, at least from the ground in Iran, what do we know so far, and how successful was that attack for Israel? Or how destructive was it for Iran?
Yes, for a couple of things. One is that the Iranian armed forces knew that the Israeli regime would attack, and they were on alert. What wasn't expected was that the Israeli regime would attack senior officials, and that they would attack senior military officers, because that would be another higher phase. It would be open warfare. The Iranians thought that they would probably attack military bases and perhaps the nuclear program, but that they wouldn't go further than that because that would be madness. But of course, they miscalculated, and the Israeli regime, which carries out genocide, is quite mad. But I have to correct one thing that you said, and that is that the IAEA has never, in the past nor in the present, have they produced evidence that Iran has been pursuing a nuclear weapon. In fact, the Americans have admitted as much since 2003. The fact, though, is that Iran was never pursuing a nuclear weapon. And the IAEA Board of Governors is a very political body, and it's dominated by the West, like all other international institutions. And if people go and look at the board, the West is disproportionately powerful on the board. And they can always have a few smaller, weaker countries to join them and get their way. But if you look at the numbers, the population of countries, if you include that, the vast majority of the global South voted against the Western position. India did not vote for it. China voted against it. Russia too. So and other countries as well. So there's a lot of evidence. If your viewers look at the WikiLeaks documents, they will see that the previous head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, when he wanted to become, he was Japanese, when he wanted to become the head, he told the Americans that, look, you choose me and I'll be with you on all major issues. And that is the same today. So there's no evidence that Iran ever pursued nuclear weapons. And Netanyahu, the serial liar and genocidal monster, he has been saying Iran is on the verge of producing nuclear weapons for almost 4 decades now. I thought it was 3 decades, but Larry Johnson, a good friend, told me no, it's more than that. So Western media won't, of course, point this out. They'll simply repeat the new accusations, and they'll do what they've done in Gaza. They'll do what they did in Lebanon. I was in Lebanon during the initial week of war, and when they started bombing Beirut, and Western journalists based in Beirut who had fixers that were Lebanese, who had drivers who were Lebanese, who had producers who were Lebanese, they were saying they're bombing Hezbollah strongholds, they're bombing Hezbollah sites, whereas they knew that the Israelis were bombing civilian targets because some of their people were working there. So this is how the West functions. It justifies what the Israelis do, but this was completely unprovoked. And now that has enraged Iranians because innocent people were killed, and they've gone to the streets and they've demanded that the government respond, that the military respond.
So, Mr. Marandi, just a couple of questions. I want to go back to the attack. You said the attack was a surprise. There's also been reports, and would love to get your comments on it, what information you have, that commanders were on the ground in Iran planning these attacks. There have been reports that there were an explosive drone base, at least one, in Iran that was used for this operation. We've also got reports that vehicles that were carrying weapon systems were smuggled into Iran that allowed them to take out air defenses. Was that part of why the attack was so successful for Israel?
Actually, the attack wasn't nearly as successful as they claimed. Many of the targets that they hit were I don't remember, I don't know what the English word for it is, but they were not real. They were
Decoys.
like yes, they were decoys. So, and if you look, I posted some of these online. You see that there's no secondary explosion, even though the Israeli regime published them. So a lot of these were decoys. And as I said, the Iranian military was on alert. But yes, the Israeli regime did use drones. They have people in Iran who they've hired who work for them. They never had a base or anything like that. That's for Hollywood. But they have people who they hire and use these tiny drones to carry out attacks. And it actually shows that the intelligence agencies that were and the people who were involved in the attack on the Russian strategic bombers were the same people who were who designed these attacks in Iran, because they were using the exact same method. The planning and the way in which it was carried out was almost identical.
So what surprised me, and I said the same thing, I was speaking to the spokesman for the IDF just before this, and what surprised me with the attack, Mr. Marandi, is Iran's retaliation, Iran's attack. So I was doing an interview with a former US intelligence officer. I can't remember the name again. I should have probably checked. But we saw the attack live. And what he told me in the interview is he expected many waves. I think it was a third wave. And many missiles did strike Israeli territory. But we didn't see more waves after that. He said, Israel needs to strike decisively. And there needs to be about a couple of thousand missiles at least. And I think we saw about 200 of them, if my numbers are correct. Is that strategic by Iran? Or has Israel successfully managed to strike the missile launchers? Because Israel was also striking Iran while Iran was launching those missiles. And I'm trying to completely discuss the military aspect of it. One side is successful or the other in different ways, without getting political on who's right, who's wrong. We could discuss that afterwards.
No, the Israelis have not been able to touch any of Iran's underground missile bases or drone bases. They've been designed and created over the years so that missiles and airstrikes would not be able to destroy them. They were designed for potential American attack, where you would have heavy bombers flying overhead that would bomb them. And we saw in Yemen how the Americans failed. The Wall Street Journal admitted after the bombing campaign began that they were unable to destroy these underground bases in Yemen. Iran is a different world altogether. And that's why, after weeks of killing innocent people in Yemen, Trump had to capitulate and he backed down. In the case of Iran, they don't have the ability to touch Iran's missile bases or drone bases. And as I said, the Iranians have a lot of decoys out there, and they know how to fight.
But why was the response? Sorry to interrupt you, sir. But why was the response by Iran restrained? In your opinion, do you think that's intentional or strategic?
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, first of all, during the first few hours, the Iranians had to put in military commanders to take charge. And then the Iranians, when they began to strike back, I think, and I'm just speculating, I'm not privy to any secret information, but I think that they don't want to shock the world. What the Iranians have been doing from the very beginning in their conflict with the United States is that they've been trying to show the world, because we don't have media and we don't control the narrative like they have been able to do for the last few decades. So, for example, when Iran sits at the negotiating table, Iran knows that the United States is not being honest. We saw Witkoff in the first couple of weeks say one thing, and then he suddenly shifted position. Iran is not foolish. It knows that something is going on in Washington. Iran sees movement. Iran sees how the United States constantly flip-flops and changes its position. But Iran sits at the negotiating table so that the international community, the global South in particular, that they see that the problem is not Iran, it is the United States. In the case of Iran, Iran is not going to just suddenly fire, 2,000 missiles. They're going to hit the Israeli regime wave after wave, and I'm pretty sure that in the coming hours we're going to see that again. This is probably going to be a confrontation that will last a while. And the Iranians want ordinary Israelis to get sick and tired of what Netanyahu has imposed upon them. And the belief in Tehran is that the regime, the Netanyahu regime, is really acting in the interest of Netanyahu rather than in the interest of the broader Zionist population. And he's only destroying, he's destroyed the image of the regime, but the Iranians want to make sure that Israelis over the coming days and weeks understand that what Netanyahu has brought upon them.
So essentially, what you're saying, Iran's strategy right now is not to use all the missiles they have at their disposal, or the launchers they have at their disposal, and be prepared for a prolonged war. But there's many that are comparing this to Hezbollah. Hezbollah was decapitated at such speed, and in this case, many would argue it was done even quicker, that people expected Hezbollah to be ready for a prolonged war, but that wasn't the case because the capabilities were destroyed relatively quickly. You're saying, obviously, Iran is not Hezbollah. Iran is significantly larger. It's much larger territory, been preparing for a very long time, much stronger military. But there is an argument, there's a narrative at least, that Iran's capacity to respond has been severely damaged. Based on your response, you're saying that is not the case, and Iran is strategically responding gradually each day, sending missiles, and you'd expect a new wave of missiles today if that is the case, correct?
I think time will tell. First of all, Hezbollah was not defeated, and Hezbollah's capabilities exist now. The Israeli regime was never able to access Hezbollah's underground capabilities. And they can produce as much propaganda as they want. It's just like what we saw in Yemen. In Yemen, the Americans, the defense secretary, Trump, were constantly saying, we're wiping them out, they're on their knees, they're begging. You recall that they're begging to talk, they want to end this. But what happened? The Americans capitulate. The Israeli regime was unable to take a single town in Lebanon. They only entered Lebanon after the ceasefire because they were in violation of the ceasefire, and the guarantors of that ceasefire, the Americans and the Europeans, were silent about it. And that shows again that you cannot trust the West. The global South sees that. Just like in Gaza, Witkoff went and installed and negotiated the ceasefire. Days later, Trump said all Palestinians must go. We must ethnically cleanse Gaza. That was Trump's ceasefire. So this is the behavior of the United States. But no, if Israel was able to win the war in Lebanon, they wouldn't have asked for a ceasefire, and they would not have accepted the ceasefire.
Because
But
we're
what they
seeing,
did
but
was after the ceasefire, they went and occupied parts of the country. After the ceasefire.
But we've seen attacks since the ceasefire, attacks by Israel on Lebanese territory, and Hezbollah's not even responding. Hezbollah didn't even respond to the attack on Iran. Maybe that's another good question that I've been thinking about. Is that surprised me? I expected Hezbollah
let me respond to this first, because I didn't respond to the previous question either.
Please.
First of all, Hezbollah is not there to respond for some strike on Iran. Yemen, Hezbollah, that is the Western proxy narrative. Yemen is a proxy. Hezbollah is everything that is critical of ethno-supremacism and ethnic cleansing and genocide. They're all proxies. But everyone who's aligned with the United States and supports this genocidal regime, they're allies and partners. So in the case of Iran, they all lack agency. They're all mercenaries, which I think is quite dishonest. It's actually the other way around. Yemen, if they were mercenaries, they wouldn't have been so steadfast under such brutal and barbaric bombardments by the Americans. And the same is true in Lebanon. They struggled, they fought in order to put pressure on the Israeli regime to halt the genocide, to halt the Holocaust. That's what Hezbollah did. Hezbollah fought heroically. And the Israeli regime, if they were able to dismantle Hezbollah, they would have done so. But Hezbollah and the resistance exists in a country where there are 40 Western embassies full of NGOs, and there is a minority in Lebanon which is aligned to Israel and the Israeli regime. They were partners with the Israeli regime when in 1982 they invaded Lebanon, and they were the ones who carried out the massacres, such as the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, which I'm sure you know about, where 3,500 Lebanese and Palestinians were slaughtered by people like the Lebanese forces. So Hezbollah has to fight in a way in which the stability of Lebanon does not fall, where the country which is divided does not fall into some sort of civil war. But Yemen is different, because Ansarullah and the Lebanese armed forces, they control the country. They control the areas where 80% of the population lives. Iran is a country. It is united. And thus, Iran does not have the sort of concerns that Hezbollah does.
I want to get your thoughts on what we could expect from Iran moving forward. Look, to be honest, I feel like Israel's left Iran no choice. Iran cannot do anything. There's no way they can negotiate when they're being struck by Israel that is continuous, that is ongoing right now. I feel like the capacity to respond has also been limited. Israel had a very successful strike, rightly or wrongly, and I think a military strike was not the right thing to do. There were negotiations on Sunday. That's my stance.
Time will tell if Iran
exactly time will tell. But the amount of commanders and officials that were killed in such a short period of time, the fact that there were commandos, Mossad commandos on the ground allegedly in Iran. Obviously, we've seen the drones.
Let me just correct that. These are not Israeli commandos. That's nonsense. These are ordinary people who they hire through WhatsApp, through Telegram, and through other means, and who they pay through Bitcoin and other such means. And by the way, the Iranians do the same. That's why you see so many Israelis have been arrested over the past few months that they said were spying for Iran. I would assume that's the same method of recruitment. So no, Iran is a country of 90 million people.
We've seen the previous attacks.
I mean, Mario, if these commandos were so good, why couldn't they take any Lebanese villages during the fighting? Why have they been unable to take the Gaza Strip after 20 months? After 20 months of genocide, of slaughter, of wiping, of exterminating Palestinians, they've still been, no,
And
the Israeli forces are not
but
nearly as good as.
another way of looking at it, though, is Israel still waging a war in Gaza. Yet the world seems to be more silent than ever. Hezbollah is no longer responding. The Houthis' attacks on Israel have not stopped, but they've eased significantly. And now we're seeing Iran being struck as we speak, or at least throughout the day. And Iran's retaliation was 3 or 4 waves of missiles. Again, I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but it just seems that Israel has complete air superiority over Iran. And Iran is put in a position that they have no choice but to respond militarily, but these capabilities have also been eroded relatively quickly. So what worries me is I just don't know what's next. That's what worries me. Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, which seems the last resort that could cripple the Iranian economy. Maybe that could be a good question for you. Is that a possibility? That would cripple the Iranian economy, but that was also severely hurt the global economy, and I think that would start putting pressure on Israel. But that's always been said when I talk to analysts. They've always said that this is the last resort for Iran. First, is that a genuine threat in your opinion? But second, what could Iran do, or what will Iran do? I know time will tell, but is there anything Iran could do other than just keep sending missiles towards Israel? Would they agree for a deal maybe with the US just to stop this war?
Well, your assumption is incorrect that the Israelis have air superiority. First of all, the Israeli regime is fundamentally weak. The only reason why this genocidal regime exists is because it has full support of the United States and the Europeans as an ethno-supremacist regime. The United States, which speaks of human rights and human equality, it is supporting racial hierarchy. It is supporting the idea of a hierarchy of humanity, a chosen people who believe that others are subhuman. That's why the Israeli defense minister says, I will burn Tehran, just like he wanted to burn Gaza and burn Lebanon, mowing the grass, the Dahia doctrine, because they consider all others as subhuman. So the West is supporting this evil ideology, and something which so many Jews protest against. They say that you're doing this in our name. We see so many young heroic Jews in the United States. You know their names. I don't want to name them because I'll miss many names and I don't want to forget anyone. But you have excellent outlets who themselves are at the forefront of the resistance against this ideology. So the only reason why the Zionist regime exists, the only reason why it can carry out this Holocaust, this extermination in Gaza, is because they have the full backing of the United States elites and the full backing of elites in Europe. And of course, the propaganda machine of the mainstream media. That's A. B, they do not have domination over Iran. They do not dominate Iranian airspace, and they're not destroying the country. And again, time will tell. 2-3 weeks from now, people can review this interview and see how weak and vulnerable Iran. And the Iranian armed forces, all of those commanders, the 6, 7, 8 commanders who were martyred, all of them now have been replaced by other senior commanders, people who've been involved in the armed forces since the Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq. So have no doubt that in the days ahead, you're going to see the Iranians strike the Israeli regime. Iran has absolutely no shortage of missiles. Iran will continue to build up the pressure against the regime. They've been planning for this for a very long time. And I would argue that the Israeli regime has made a fundamental mistake by carrying out this aggression, because they have united the Iranian population in a way which I haven't seen since Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And we saw people on the streets yesterday demanding that the armed forces retaliate and that the government retaliate. And you can look at my Twitter account and you can see people in Tehran and other cities who are on the streets, despite the threats made by the regime to burn Tehran. They were on the streets in huge crowds, celebrating an Eid today, but also in defiance of the regime. So
Do you think
time
Iran
will
would?
tell.
Oh,
Again, I've said this 3 or 4
sorry to interrupt.
times.
Would
Yeah,
would Iran close the Straits of Hormuz, or would they try to shut the Straits of Hormuz?
the Strait of Hormuz, I think, and it's not just. By the way, the Strait of Hormuz is only one way of responding to the Americans, but this would be a response to the Americans. Trump is, of course, deeply involved in this aggression, and he gloats about it. And he's only harmed himself by behaving this way, because the day before he was speaking as if he was against it, then the day after he was gloating about it, basically saying that this was all a show and deceit. Well, if that's the case, then the globe now knows that not only does Trump flip-flop all the time and shift his position all the time, but he's also deceitful. So when the Chinese want to negotiate, the Russians want to negotiate, whoever wants to negotiate with Americans, know that Trump is a man of deceit and who gloats about it. He's fundamentally harmed the United States by doing this. But that aside, if the United States gets directly involved, if Trump is insane enough to get directly involved on behalf of this genocidal regime, then Iran will have to retaliate. And that would mean not just the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but also all the US bases and assets in the region will be targeted. And those regimes in the region, those tiny Arab dictatorships, family dictatorships, that host those bases will be seen as complicit. And they will be immediately swept away. Mario, Iran has huge assets that can target Israel, and we will see in the coming days. But the assets that Iran has to destroy its adversaries in the Persian Gulf region are far, far greater, because the Persian Gulf is right beside us, and it is not very wide. And those palaces, or those palaces on the other side of the Persian Gulf, are glass palaces. So these Arab dictators should be very worried about the decisions made by Trump in the coming days, and the whole world should be worried, because if Trump attacks Iran, then that, I believe, not that I believe, I'm sure that that would bring about an economic collapse across the world, because
So
oil would go through the roof.
just to be clear, when you're talking about the governments that house US military bases, you're talking about Bahrain, Saudi, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Jordan, and even the
Whoever.
UAE, which is behind me here. Those would become targets for Iran if the US directly gets involved.
Where are you born, Mario?
I was born in Lebanon.
You're in Lebanon, right?
I'm in Dubai now, but
Okay,
I'm
you're in
originally
Dubai.
Australian, but I live in Dubai. Yes.
You're Australian. Let's say you're Australian and a neighboring country, or you're American and a neighboring country, or you're British or French and a neighboring country invades and attacks you. And a third country is assisting that country. It's hosting its bases, it's hosting its missiles, it's hosting its air force as it's bombing you. Are you going to consider that country complicit or not? Of course you will. So either those bases are not used and the United States is forced to stay out of this fight, which it would be the same thing to do, or all bets are off. But you can't have your
All bets are
cake
off.
and
As in,
eat it too.
would you only strike those US military bases, or you mean there's a possibility, or when you say all bets are off, that you could strike strategic targets in the countries that house US military bases beyond just the bases?
Mario, I'm not in the government. I'm not in the military. I'm a professor. But those bases are in tiny countries that are responsible for what happens in their country. If those bases, if those assets are used against the Iranian people, then those countries that host those bases are fully responsible. And you know that those countries would not last more than a few days. and the indentured servants and the slaves in those countries would probably take over. So the smart thing to do is for Trump to stay out of this. And the smart thing to do would be for these family dictatorships to make sure Trump stays out of this. Iran is not going to let the United States use bases in neighboring countries against it, and these people go and their leaders enjoy themselves in their palaces. That's not going to happen.
Netanyahu also said that we are clearing the path for you to achieve your objective, which is freedom. He's reaching out to the Iranian people. The time has come for you to unite around your flag and your stark legacy by standing up for your freedom from an evil and oppressive regime. It has never been weaker. This is your opportunity to stand up and let your voice be heard. Women, life, freedom. Brave people of Iran, your light will defeat the darkness. I am with you. The people of Israel are with you. So many experts saw this as an attempt for a regime change. Do you think Israel is just trying to target? So the IDF spokesperson told me the goal is to target the Iran's nuclear facilities, Iran's ballistic missiles, and Iran's proxies, which obviously has been done in the last 2 years. So would you say a regime change is potentially one of the objectives of Israel?
First of all, Mario, these are not proxies. These groups have
allies.
agency. And the Israeli regime has been unable to get rid of anyone. They have failed in Gaza, let alone Yemen, where the Americans backed off. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah is still there. And you saw the local elections in Lebanon and how pro-resistance candidates swept the board wherever they stood. So Hezbollah is very popular in Lebanon. So the Israeli regime has not won. The only place where they succeeded was when they helped the US and others bring Al-Qaeda and ISIS to power in Syria. The United States has now removed sanctions from Al-Qaeda governed Syria, but they imposed brutal sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba. So Al-Qaeda and ISIS are now the good guys, and Jolani or Sharat will go to the UN General Assembly to give a speech, but Cubans have to be strangled. This is the world that we're living in today. But the Israeli regime has not succeeded in Syria either, because Syria has this black hole that they've created is going to destroy the resources of the countries around it. It's going to become a problem for the Israeli regime and for those who've helped the Israeli regime bring about the collapse of Syria. But in any case, going back to Iran, of course the Israeli regime and the Americans and their allies want regime change. They've wanted that for 40-some years now. That has always been the objective, ever since the revolution. Before the revolution, we had a regime that was a proxy of the United States. 90% of the oil that went to apartheid South Africa came from Iran. After the revolution, they cut the oil, broke off ties, and supported the ANC military wing and other militant military organizations, or terrorist organizations as they call them in the West, in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, as the West was supporting apartheid. And the same was done towards Palestine. Iran, the Shah, the dictator, the brutal dictator, he was supporting the Israeli regime. We had an embassy in Tehran, literally an embassy, and now it's the Palestinian embassy after the revolution changed. And of course, Iran became an independent country. That was what the revolution was about, having independence, and where the decisions are made in Tehran. Iran is not a part of NATO or any other organization. It is independent. We have no foreign bases, and we make our decisions in Tehran. That, of course, is something that the United States dislikes. And of course, Iran's opposition to ethno-supremacism is what makes Iran so evil. Iran, Mario, the fundamental issue for the last the issue is not the nuclear program. The issue has never been the nuclear program. The issue has never been human rights or terrorism. If they could make it global warming, if they could make global warming a reason to sanction Iran, they'd do that. The issue is Iran's support for Palestine. Because Iran, and more recently after the change in Yemen, Iran is the only country that actively supports the people of Palestine. It's the only country that is actively opposed, only government, that is alongside Yemen, that is actively opposed to this genocidal regime. So Iran is the bad guy because we, as sinister Iranians, are opposed to the notion of a chosen people, ethno-supremacism, ethnic cleansing, and colonization. That's why we're so bad. And if we ever try to mention this, they would say you're anti-Semite. And then, of course, the notion of so they back the notion of a chosen people. So we are against this chosen people, the notion, we believe that all are equal. Do you know, Mario, and I'm pretty sure you do, you know that in Iran we have synagogues. You know that in Iran we have kosher restaurants. There are no armed guards in front of any synagogues in Iran because no one would ever touch anyone in a synagogue. Jews in Iran are in government. Jews in Iran have businesses. On average, they're more wealthy than the ordinary Iranian. On average, and they have a member in parliament, because according to the constitution after the revolution, the Jewish minority, Christian minorities, Armenians, Zoroastrians, and they have to have members in parliament. So we have a Jewish member in parliament in accordance with the constitution after the revolution. So our opposition is not against Judaism, and it's not against Semites, because actually the Palestinians are the Semites. The Ashkenazi Jews are not Semites, but and the others are from across the region, and other places. So that's nonsense. It's just a way to justify ethno-supremacism, genocide, and ethnic cleansing by the West.
I want to go back to the situation on the ground right now. What are the risks of a full-scale regional conflict? So you did hint at one red line that Iran has, which is US direct involvement, because US is obviously indirectly involved by supplying weapons, arms and weapons, and even security, and by shooting down the Iranian drones to Israel. But direct involvement, I assume that means direct bombing by the US.
More than that, by the way. The United States uses its bases in Turkey, in Iraq, in the Emirates, in Qatar, in Bahrain, and elsewhere to help the Israeli regime in all sorts of different ways, both defensively and offensively.
Refueling, intelligence. But
radar,
the red line that you have, though, is direct strikes by the US on Iran. And if that line is crossed, in your opinion, the Iranian military would potentially strike US bases in neighboring regions and potentially other strategic targets in those Arab countries. So I want to clarify that red line is direct US strikes on Iran.
Look, Mario, I don't want to be provocative, but any regime that is complicit will pay the price. Any regime that is complicit. I gave the example before. So you cannot have your cake and eat it too. That's not going to happen.
How do you expect that? Oh, sorry,
but also, it doesn't mean that U.S. support for the Israeli regime as we see it today will be without consequences. But my understanding of the situation is that there are different scenarios. And so it doesn't mean that there's a red line, but before that red line, it's all okay for the United States.
How do you anticipate China and Russia to respond to this? Obviously, China is a strong trading partner with Iran. Russia has an agreement, a defense agreement with Iran as well. I think it was signed in January. Considering those relationships and the fact Iran is part of BRICS, how far do you think Israel can go before China and Russia potentially step in, whether through supplying weapons to Iran? I'm not sure if this is happening at the moment, or potentially further involvement, pressuring Israel in other ways?
Well, the entire world is against the Israeli regime in the United States. And we have to stress that the driving force is the United States. The Israeli regime cannot do anything without the United States. If the United States halted aid for 1 month, the regime would fail. It would fall. It can't even fight in Gaza without 24 hours a day support from the United States. And it's just obliterating women and children with US support and with European support. But the American support matters more. than European support. Otherwise, European elites are just as monstrous and genocidal when it comes to Gaza. They're all partners in Gaza. Anyone who is sitting on the wall, anyone who's standing in the middle right now is complicit, let alone these genocidal monsters in Europe and the United States who are supporting the Israeli regime in any way or form. And countries in the region who are cooperating with the Israeli regime, who trade with the regime, who recognize the regime, who do business in any way or form, they're also complicit. We're all complicit, all of us who don't stand up against what is clear as day. It is as clear as what was happening in apartheid South Africa. In fact, it's far worse. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when who passed away and who was one of the heroes of the resistance in apartheid South Africa, of course there were many heroes, but he was a well-known figure. When he went to Palestine, he said that back then, not now, he said that the situation in Palestine, and again, people can look this up right now as they watch, the situation is much worse than it was in South Africa. That's someone who I think the West also gave him.
Do you think Russia and China could go as far as stepping in or supplying more weapons to Iran, or exerting further pressure on Israel?
Well, first of all, Iran is a powerful country, and it is fully prepared to defend itself. During the Iran-Iraq War, or the war that where Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, he was a despot, and Iraqis did not want that. But when he invaded Iran, Iran was all alone. In fact, back then, both blocs, the Soviet Union and the United States, supported Saddam Hussein. And Germany and the West in general, they provided Saddam Hussein even with chemical weapons. I survived two chemical attacks, Mario. I survived mustard gas on one occasion during the last stages of the war, and I survived a nerve agent in the earlier years during the Khaybar operation in the war. Who provided these weapons to Saddam Hussein? It was these very same human rights countries called EU countries, that the civilized world, right? It was the civilized world that did it. And not only did they provide Saddam with chemical weapons and military intelligence to use it and political cover to get away with it, but they prevented Iran from purchasing gas masks. That's the West. So when you look to the past, you can see why they behave as they do today and how they support genocide in Gaza. The same people, by the way, these are the Germans whose role in the Second World War is clear for everyone, and what they did during the Second World War. They are the people who were leading this gas weapons industry, developing the gas industry or weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to use against Iranians and against their own people. And only after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait did suddenly he become the bad guy in the West. But back then, Iran was all alone, and Iran was able to preserve its sovereignty. Iran today has many friends, and you mentioned them, across the global south, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. Iran is not isolated today. The United States is isolated. The West is increasingly isolated. And the Israeli regime is almost universally despised. So I think that Iran is in a much stronger position today than it was in the 1980s.
How about the nuclear enrichment facilities? Israel aims to either dismantle or significantly set back those facilities, or at least those capabilities. How successful do you think that attack has been? I think there's one, we know most of the major facilities have been struck, except Furlough, I think it's called, which is the one that's 800 meters underground, which is very difficult, if not impossible, for Israel to reach, even according to the former Israeli prime minister. But we know the attacks on the military leadership has been successful. A lot of them have been assassinated or killed. But in terms of the nuclear facilities, that one's being debated right now.
They have not eliminated the military leadership. The military, we have many military commanders, and now they're all working to defend the country as we speak. It's we have many generals, and they are working to defend the country.
But
And
we could say they've eliminated, but they did eliminate some of the leading general, the leader of the IRGC, the armed forces.
It was a surprise attack
I
where they
understand
targeted.
I understand why. I understand it was a
They
surprise. Yes.
targeted apartment buildings in Tehran, murdering neighbors, murdering families, murdering the families of neighbors. That's not a brilliant attack, Mario. That is inhumane and crude. There's nothing heroic or nothing Hollywood-like in this. It is just disgusting. It's
So
despicable.
yeah, not
However,
justifying it. Just not. That's why I'm not saying it's
yeah,
heroic. Just saying that
yeah.
we
So
know that they were
yeah,
they
they
were
took
killed.
out the
Iran said they were
leadership.
killed. Exactly, but we
No,
don't know about the nuclear facilities. We don't know the details of the damage, which is why I want to get your thoughts on it, because we're
no.
getting different thoughts
The
there.
nuclear facilities are intact. Those buildings that are on the surface are not important. Everything, Mario, that is sensitive in Iran, which can be targeted by the United States, has been taken underground over the
Even
years.
in Natanz, which is the main one.
Everything that is key to Iran is deep underground, because we have been expecting US airstrikes for 2 decades. After the United States invaded Afghanistan, which is itself an interesting story, they created these extremists, Carter and Brzezinski. They funded them so that the Soviet Union would enter Afghanistan. Then they funded the extremists. They even printed school books, takfiri school books of extremists for extremists. They published them at a university in the United States, Nebraska Omaha University. People can look it up. They published these takfiri books so that people would hate the Russians. They spread this destruction. I'll get there. And they destroyed Afghanistan. They created this mess, extremist mess. They brought about 9/11. Even if we accept the Western narrative, it was still their own doing because they created the mess. And then they go and invade Afghanistan. And then after Afghanistan, they invaded Iraq by lying. Everyone knows that. It was all a lie. Al-Qaeda, weapons of mass destruction, and so on. It was all a lie. Iran was surrounded by the United States in 2003. And the United States had bases in the Persian Gulf, and the United States was back then the hyperpower. So Iran began to prepare itself. It created an indigenous military industry. It gradually took all of its key components that are key to the state and to the security of the country underground. That's why the key targets that the Americans and the Israelis would love to destroy are inaccessible.
Mr. Marandi, last question for you, sir. But first, again, I appreciate the time you've given me, considering the circumstances, security-wise and the internet. Last question is, what do you expect to see over the next 10 days? If I ask you personally, just looking, not what's right or what's wrong, where do you see us heading in the next 10 days? Because for me, it's just looking, every red line that I could imagine has been crossed. Initially, obviously, Gaza, I'm like, we might see, I remember after October 7th, they're going to enter Gaza. And back then one could argue it was justified, but I thought we'll end within a few months. Obviously, the war's ongoing today. Then we have striking the Houthis. Again, I wasn't too surprised on that one. But then Hezbollah, when they struck Hezbollah and the ferocity of the attack, that was a massive red line that surprised me. And then the first Iranian strike last year, back and forth between Iran and Israel, but it was a planned tit for tat within certain limitations. But now again, the strike of the Hamas leader, but more importantly, the war that we have now crossed pretty much every red line I had since October 7th, and everyone had since October 7th. The last lines pretty much left is the US directly striking Iran, which I would say was almost impossible just a few days ago, is now looking more and more possible. So what is your expectation, considering these circumstances, that we would see over the next 10, 20, and 30 days?
Well, first of all, I expected the onslaught on Lebanon because the Israeli regime has no red lines, and Netanyahu needed an escalation. And I said that in my interviews before the war. And that's why I went to Beirut the day before, because I knew something was happening and I thought I should be there to help with media. That's how the Israeli regime is. However, I should point something out, and that is that the Israeli response to October the 7th was never justified, regardless of the fact that the Western media and the Israeli regime lied through their teeth about rapes and beheadings and all that, and that the fact that the Israelis themselves murdered hundreds of their own citizens and hid that from reality and pretended that Hamas did that. But October the 6th, October the 5th, for decades before October the 7th, this was a concentration camp. It was an open air prison. Every now and then they would carry out genocidal strikes. They would prevent food from going in. They'd call it putting Palestinians in Gaza on a diet. They would call it mowing the lawn. This is a genocidal regime. October the 7th was a jailbreak. If it's like saying that if the Jews and the Gypsies and the Slavs who were in Nazi prisons, they broke out on their concentration camps, they broke out and killed some of the Germans living in the village next door, that they were the ones who were provocative. That's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. What they've done, and the Palestinians in Gaza are from Palestine. They were expelled from their homes in Palestine and sent to Gaza in this concentration camp. But you're right, the Israeli regime has no red lines, and its backers have no red lines. That's why they can that's why they can exterminate Palestinians for over 20 months, and Western media will somehow pretend as if Israel is a legitimate regime. They can be openly racist and call Palestinians Amalek, and they will still be called a democracy in the West. And that's how Western media will present them. They will be seen as civilized. They can be openly. You saw the South African complaint. Go read the first few pages of the South African complaint against the Israeli regime, and you'll see how the president, the prime minister, the defense minister, the head of the head of the Knesset, the deputy head of the Knesset, MPs, government officials, they were all saying, we're going to wipe these people out. They're subhuman. There are no innocents in Gaza. These are all out there for everyone to read. But still, we are the ones who are uncivilized. We're the bad guys. So yes, for the West, there are no red lines. For supremacists, there are no red lines. Because when you, Mario, are subhuman to me, anything I do to you is legitimate for me. That is the problem.
So you think,
the Israeli regime has no red lines, and its backers have no red lines. And that's why Iran has no option but to be strong. And Iran will support the Palestinian people no matter what. Iran, from one of the very principles of this revolution, was that it opposes this ethno-supremacism in Palestine, and it will not accept it. Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live as equals, but there cannot be a chosen people. Iran will not accept that. And Zionism is an enemy of the Jewish people, because Zionists are the ones who create this anti-Semitism, if we can call it that, because many Jews, as I said, are not Semites. But they're the ones who are trying to say that Jews support genocide, and Jews who don't have media and who don't have access to ABC, NBC, CBS, the BBC, and so on, and Fox News and so on, who are saying no to all of this. Their voices are not being heard. And so people across the world, many people across the world, falsely believe the Israeli narrative, that these are the Jews, because they cannot hear the voices of those courageous Jews that are standing against Zionism. So the Zionist regime is the greatest enemy of the Jewish people.
Mr. Mohammed Marandi, really appreciate your time, and I hope you and your family continue to be okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, sir.